Hello, students, and welcome to week one lecture. This will be a pretty short lecture, but really I want to just talk about week one and a few change models we're going to look at. I'll kind of give you real quickly 10, but we're really only going to look at a few of those in this class that are very important. But midweek on Wednesday, you'll have a post that's due, and I'm excited about your posting this week because it really is without a whole lot of material in front of you, just the Bible. And I want you to do theology. I want you to look at the first 6 chapters of the book of Acts, but really zero in on Acts 6, 1 through 7. There was a dynamic, not so dynamic. Some people would probably read through it and not even recognize the full context of the change that happened in these first 7 verses of Acts 6. But really, change happened that set the church up really to where we see the church today, even. And the chapter starts out with a complaint arose. And oftentimes, change happens because a complaint arises or something's not working, and you have to look at what that change is. So, I want you to do theology. I want you to put it in context, but I want you to look at in this post what brought about this complaint. This was the early church. We don't know how old the church was in chapter 6 chronologically, but we know it was a fairly young church, and we know that there's a life cycle to every church. You're going to read about that next week. And this church probably was beginning to plateau a little bit because people weren't being served. And, one of your resources this week is Flourishing, Made to Flourish, and this church was flourishing. But at the same time, you can stop its flourishing by not recognizing change that needs to be made. And these early apostles recognized right away. They got together and talked it through and made a change. And that change really became a dynamic change that Ephesians, the 4th chapter, talked about. And throughout the Bible, or throughout the New Testament after this, talked about structural changes of the church that again affect us today. So I want you to look at that, really want you to narrow in on what the change was, what brought about the change, and then what was the immediate effects of the change. We know that change has both intended and unintended consequences, both negative and positive. But I want you to look at those, and I'll just give you a little hint. I'm probably giving you way too much information, but I love to just look through the book of Acts and look at the text where it says, after this happened, the church multiplied, or the word of God increased. And that really is a congregation of flourishing. And so I want you to look at that in Acts, the 6th chapter. And as you engage this resource, I think you're going to like it. As I said in my opening video, man, I've marked this book up a lot. It really is a powerful book. Everything that God created was made to flourish. And so when can we tell when flourishing is happening? When can we diagnose that we need to make some changes for further flourishing? And let's talk for a couple minutes about some change models. And it's interesting when you look at the change models, and you can just Google change models in 2024. I'm looking at a resource right now like that. Some change models have to do with strategy, and we'll talk a little bit about that, one of the models that I'll refer to often. But it's not just strategy about change, but what are the process that people go through when you change something. And that's very, very important. And so I'll just name these real quickly. The Lewis change model, the McKinsey 7S model, the nudge model, all have to do with kind of nudging people towards change. We know that change takes time, and there's a process to change. The ADKAR change model, management model, the Kubler change curve, which talks about, at first there's disappointment and shock and anger and even depression, and then acceptance, and how people process change. That's what that really talks about. The Bridges transition model, we're going to talk about it at the end of this class. It's one of my favorite people-oriented change model. And really, Bridges talk about the fact that, it's never change that messes with people, because change is so normal, especially in these days. Man, things are changing all the time. But it's the transition, the emotional transition that it takes for people. And all of us lead people. And, how do changes that we make affect people? It's very important that we know that. Also, the Satir change model, Cotter's 8-step theory, we're going to talk a little bit about that. In fact, I've included that in either this week or next week's reading in a PDF. It's probably the most popular change model. It has more to do with the strategy of change. And so we'll talk about that. Moyer level of resistance and change, and then the Deming cycle. Later on, we'll talk about the diffusion model, or the diffusion cycle of how people process change. And so change is so important for every organization. Doesn't matter what organization you lead. Probably most of us listening today deal with people. And I always say this, listen, when we talk about change, we have to consider people. Jesus led by being a shepherd. He said, I'm the great shepherd. In other words, he wasn't a cowboy. And oftentimes in our worship of leadership, we kind of think that leadership is about being a cowboy. I want to do this change, and it doesn't matter how it affects people, and people are going to have to get on the bus or get off the bus. I heard a leader say one time, don't let the door hit you as you leave. And guess what? People will leave. Whatever it is you're doing, whether you're managing people in a corporation, you're the boss, or you're leading a congregation where volunteers are involved and staff are involved, and people don't have to come to our churches. And so how we manage and navigate people through those stages, that's why I believe that Jesus calls, the church to have a shepherding gift on it. In fact, all of the gifts seem to be connected to pastoral ministry, to shepherding gifts. And so it's important that we recognize that. Let's look at the Cotter model for just a minute. This is an 8-step change model. And it really has to deal with kind of strategy. The first 4 have to do with defreezing the existing culture. Sometimes when a culture is set, some of you are in organizations, maybe churches that have been around for a long time, and there's a set culture. And you kind of have to shock it to defreeze it. It's set in concrete, and you kind of have to do some things that are shocking. But to do that, Cotter says first 4 steps should be, you need to establish a sense of urgency. In other words, if we keep going the same way we're going now, we won't have a future. Some people call that the burning platform theory. And then form a coalition. Find out who your early adopters are, which is the diffusion model, by the way. We'll talk about that later. But form a powerful coalition of early and mid adopters and create a vision. What will this change look like? What is our preferred future? If we stay here, we won't reach our preferred future. And then communicate. Find ways of communicating. And then managing or making change happen has to do with removing the obstacles. I serve an organization called Foursquare, and if Foursquare is going to change significantly, they have to actually remove obstacles, and that means even redoing bylaws. And organizations have the privilege of doing that. Bylaws are living documents, and they can change those. But what are the obstacles to that vision? And then plan for and create short-term wins. Everybody loves a win. And what are short-term wins in creating change? And then consolidate improvements. Keep on talking about what are the improvements because of this change. So you've defreezed the culture. Now you're making things happen in kind of wet concrete. And now it's time to refreeze the culture. Because if you don't do that, then every wind of change will come around and you'll change everything. And you see that oftentimes in leaders. All they talk about is change. And people don't navigate those things well. So number 8 has to do with refreezing the culture, and that's institutionalized change. And by the way, after you've done all this and the given change, probably another leader someday is going to come along, or maybe you 5 years from now is going to say, this is no longer working. We need to go through the same process again. Here's the wins from what we developed, but here's our preferred future. And so change is constant, and as change leaders, we need to understand that and really be okay with it. So again, this is just a short lecture. Most of them will be around 10, 15 minutes long, and hope you can use this in your studies this week. God bless. Have a great, great week.